The Frost family lived in a quaint cottage nestled at the edge of the village, surrounded by snow-covered trees that shimmered in the pale winter light. Each Christmas, their home was transformed into a cozy haven, a place where warmth and love could be felt in every corner. The scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked cookies and the rich, spiced smell of hot cider. To outsiders, it was the picture-perfect Christmas setting, a scene that could be painted on a holiday card. But to the Frosts, it had always been more than just the decorations and traditions. It was about family. This year, like every other, they gathered in the living room, each of them performing their little rituals as they decorated the tree. Clara, the eldest, was carefully hanging the glass ornaments that had been passed down for generations. Thomas, the middle child, grinned as he placed the angel on top of the tree, the angel his grandmother had once told him was magic. And little Amelia, the youngest, couldn't sit still for a second. She darted around, hanging mismatched ornaments wherever she could reach. Amelia was the first to notice the strange package. It arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn. The wind had picked up, making the bare trees creak and groan, and the chill in the air was beginning to seep through the walls of the house. The Frosts had just finished their dinner when the doorbell rang. "Who could be visiting us this late?" Clara asked, raising an eyebrow as she set down her glass of cider. She walked to the door, her footsteps crunching on the snow outside as she opened it, half expecting a neighbor with some last-minute Christmas cheer. But no one was there. Only a small, unmarked package lay on the doorstep, wrapped in faded brown paper and tied with a simple string. Clara picked it up, feeling an odd heaviness to the parcel. It was surprisingly cold, colder than the winter air around her. She glanced up and down the street, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the quiet village, blanketed in snow. "Is it for us?" Amelia asked eagerly, bouncing on her heels as she looked up at her older sister, her eyes wide with curiosity. Clara nodded and brought the package inside, placing it on the table. "It's addressed to the Frost family," she said, lifting the string. "I wonder who could have sent it." Mr. Frost, the father, glanced at the package with a frown. He had been quiet all evening, unusually distant. His eyes seemed clouded, as though he were lost in thought. "Could be from one of the villagers," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe it's a mistake." Without waiting for an answer, Amelia jumped to the table and eagerly began to peel away the paper. The family watched in silence as she slowly unwrapped the package, revealing a delicate porcelain doll nestled inside. The doll was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Its face was painted with a soft, almost lifelike glow, the pale cheeks and ruby-red lips in stark contrast to its dark eyes, which seemed too deep, too knowing. The doll was dressed in a faded red velvet dress with intricate lace trim, and its small porcelain hands were delicately posed as though it were holding something invisible. It had a dainty bonnet trimmed with lace and tiny shoes that gleamed in the soft glow of the Christmas lights. The details were exquisite, almost unnerving. Amelia gasped, "It's beautiful." Mr. Frost's brow furrowed. "It's odd. Who would send such a thing without a note?" "Maybe it's a gift," Clara said, trying to sound upbeat, though her voice was tinged with a Christmas surprise? Her mother, Alice Frost, had been unusually quiet since the doll's arrival. She eyed the doll cautiously, her hands hovering over it, as though she couldn't quite bring herself to touch it. "It's a little lifelike, don't you think?" she whispered, her voice tight. Amelia, undeterred by her mother's hesitation, eagerly picked up the doll and cradled it in her arms. She seemed mesmerized by it, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the tree as she examined the doll with a reverence that was almost religious. "It's mine," she declared happily, clutching the doll to her chest. "I'll name her Evelyn." Despite the initial unease, the family watched as Amelia carried the doll around the house, excitedly showing it off to each of them. She sat it at the dinner table, propped it up against the window, and even placed it beside the fireplace, as though the doll was becoming part of the family. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking the passing of time, as the frost outside began to settle into the corners of the house. The evening passed in a haze of holiday music and laughter, but as the family settled down for the night, something felt off. The house, which had felt warm and inviting only hours ago, now seemed colder. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it was not enough to chase the chill from the corners of the rooms. Clara, lying in bed, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She glanced toward the living room, her eyes drifting toward the mantel. There, sitting as innocently as ever, was the porcelain doll. She felt a sudden shiver run through her body, and for a moment it seemed as though the doll's eyes were following her, watching her movements from across the room. Clara shook her head, trying to push the thought away. "It's just my imagination," she told herself. "It's just a doll." But when she closed her eyes to sleep, she couldn't escape the sense of unease that clung to the air like an invisible weight. The house creaked and groaned with the shifting of the wind outside, but there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a sound she couldn't quite place that seemed to drift in from the hallway. The next morning, the Frost family woke to a strange silence. Amelia was still asleep, curled up in her bed with Evelyn clutched tightly in her arms. As the family gathered around the table for breakfast, something caught their attention. The doll was missing from its spot by the fire. A quiet, uneasy silence fell over the table as they all looked at each other, wondering what had happened. Where could the doll have gone? They had all been asleep when the night had passed, and the house had been locked up tight. Amelia woke and looked around, clearly puzzled. "Where's Evelyn?" she asked, her voice trembling with the confusion. A chill ran down Clara's spine. The doll was gone, and so was the uneasy feeling that had hung in the air. The doll's absence was worse than its presence. In that moment, they all knew something had changed, something had begun. The morning after Evelyn's disappearance passed in a blur of confusion and whispered worries. The Frost family searched the house from attic to basement, opening every closet and crawling under every bed. But there was no trace of the doll. Amelia grew increasingly distressed, her small hands wringing at the hem of her nightgown. "She wouldn't leave me," Amelia insisted, her bottom lip quivering. "She said we'd always be together." At first, her parents exchanged uneasy glances, chalking it up to Amelia's overactive imagination. Children had a way of personifying their toys, but there was something about the certainty in her voice, the way she said, that made Clara's stomach knot tightly. By afternoon, the search was abandoned. The day grew heavy with gray clouds, and the sun barely pierced the thick sky. A light snow began to fall, dusting the ground in a pristine white that seemed, somehow, to make everything quieter. Too quiet. Then, just after dusk, they found her. Amelia spotted the doll first. She let out a gleeful cry, rushing toward the fireplace. There, perched delicately on the mantel as though it had never left, was Evelyn. The same cold smile, the same dark, watchful eyes. Only this time, something was different. Tucked into the doll's porcelain hand was a small, yellowed scrap of paper. Mr. Frost carefully removed it, holding it up to the light. Written in a spidery, elegant hand were 5 chilling words. "The game begins at dusk." A cold hush fell over the room. Mrs. Frost's hand flew to her mouth, and Thomas instinctively stepped closer to Clara. "It's a prank," Mr. Frost said, though he didn't sound convinced. But deep down, each of them knew better. There was a weight in the room now, pressing against their chests, a heaviness that had not been there before. Later that evening, Mrs. Frost insisted on visiting Marta, the village's oldest resident, and some whispered, "It's wisest." Marta lived alone in a crumbling house at the far edge of the village, where the woods crept close to the windows and strange herbs hung drying from the rafters. As the family approached Marta's home, the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, bitter smell, like burnt wood and cold iron. Mrs. Frost knocked 3 times, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. Marta was a small woman, bent with age but sharp-eyed. She peered at them for a long moment before stepping aside to let them in. Inside, the house was dim, lit by flickering candles. Shadows danced along the walls, and strange trinkets filled every surface. Old books, rusted keys, bundles of dried herbs tied with red string. It was a place that felt ancient, untouched by time. Without waiting for them to speak, Marta said in a low, rasping voice, "You found it, didn't you?" Mrs. Frost hesitated. "The doll?" Marta nodded slowly, her lined face grave. It's found you, not the other way around. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. What do you mean? It's just a toy. Marta let out a soft, humorless laugh. There are no just toys in this world, boy. They sat around Marta's fire as she told them the story. A story that chilled the marrow of their bones. Long ago, over a century past, there lived a girl named Isabel Whitlock. Isabel was the beloved only child of the wealthiest family in the village. But despite their riches, the Whitlocks were plagued by tragedy. Isabel's mother had died giving birth to her, and her father, desperate to protect his only daughter, turned to all manner of strange and forbidden practices. When Isabel fell ill, a wasting sickness that no doctor could cure, her father sought out a traveling mystic, a woman said to have powers that could defy death itself. In exchange for an unnamed favor to be paid later, the mystic crafted a doll, Evelyn, and instructed Isabel's father to place it at her bedside. For a time, the doll seemed to work. Isabel's strength returned, her cheeks flushed with color, and laughter filled the halls of the Whitlock mansion once more. But it was not a true recovery. At night, the servants whispered of hearing footsteps in the corridors when no one was there. Of laughter, high, girlish, and wrong, echoing through the empty rooms. Isabel's temperament changed. She grew cruel, secretive. Her once bright eyes became cold and hard, and she spent all her time with the doll, whispering to it, confiding in it as if it were a living being. One terrible Christmas Eve, something unimaginable happened. Every member of the Whitlock household, the maids, the butlers, the cooks, even Isabel's grieving father, were found dead. Some had fled into the snowy woods, their bodies later discovered frozen solid, their faces twisted in masks of horror. Others were found inside the house, their bodies broken as if dropped from great heights. And Isabel? She was found sitting serenely by the fire, her doll cradled in her arms, a smile on her lips, her body as cold as the snow outside. No one could explain it. No one wanted to. The villagers, terrified of the evil that lingered, burned the Whitlock mansion to the ground. But the doll was never found. It was said to have survived the flames, untouched, unharmed, carried away by something unseen. Over the decades, the doll reappeared, always close to Christmas, always bringing with it strange deaths and sorrow. Families who found it would vanish, their homes left abandoned, their fates whispered about but never confirmed. Marta finished her tale and stared at the frost, her eyes hard. "You must rid yourselves of it," she said, "before Christmas Day, before it finishes its game." "But how?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper, Marta's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not so simple. The doll binds itself through love, through attachment. The child has named it, loved it. It will not let her go easily." Mrs. Frost reached out, her hand trembling. "Is there a way?" Marta hesitated, then nodded. "There's a grave, Isabel's grave. The doll must be returned to her, buried with her. Only then might it be trapped once more, until some fool awakens it again." The Frosts exchanged frightened glances. The way Marta said might was not reassuring. As they prepared to leave, Marta called out one final warning. "Be careful. The doll is watching, and it is patient. It knows how to wait for its moment." The door closed behind them with a final, echoing thud, leaving them standing outside in the cold night, the snow falling heavier now, the world around them silent, as if the village itself was holding its breath. In the distance, back at their home, a single candle burned in the window, and in its faint, flickering light, if one looked closely enough, they could just make out the tiny, smiling face of a porcelain doll watching them through the glass. The Frost family returned home from Marta's cottage under a heavy, ominous sky. Snow swirled in furious gusts, rattling the bare tree branches like skeletal fingers against the windows. They barely spoke on the walk back. What was there to say? Each of them carried the weight of Marta's story like a stone in their chest. Inside their cottage, the warmth of the fire should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The flames cast long, distorted shadows across the walls, and the rooms felt colder, even with the hearth roaring. Evelyn the doll sat perched on the mantel once again, just as they had left her. She hadn't moved, but somehow she seemed closer to the edge, as if inching her way toward the family. Amelia ran to her immediately, scooping the doll into her arms with a possessive hug. She shot a sharp, almost angry glance at her mother when Mrs. Frost tried to coax her into putting it down. "She's mine now," Amelia said firmly, her voice strange, older somehow. Mrs. Frost opened her mouth to argue, but Mr. Frost put a hand on her arm. "Later," he murmured, "let's just rest for now." But rest would not come easily. That night, the house breathed with unease. The floorboards groaned under unseen footsteps. The temperature dropped so low that frost webbed across the inside of the windows, delicate white patterns that looked disturbingly like grasping hands. Clara woke sometime after midnight to the sound of whispering. At first, she thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the old cottage walls. But as she listened, heart pounding, she realized the whispers were forming words. Faint, almost inaudible, but definitely there. "Play with us. Stay forever." She bolted upright in bed, her breath misting in the cold air. Her eyes darted to the doorway. Standing there, half lost in shadow, was Amelia. "Amelia?" Clara whispered. "What are you doing?" Amelia didn't answer. In her arms, she cradled Evelyn. The doll's glassy eyes gleamed in the dark, catching the faint light of the moon. Slowly, stiffly, Amelia turned and shuffled back down the hallway, disappearing into the gloom. Clara sat frozen for a long moment before she finally slipped out of bed and hurried to check on her sister. She found Amelia tucked in her bed, sleeping soundly, Evelyn nestled against her chest. Clara closed the door gently, but even as she did, she could feel the doll's cold, dead eyes following her. The next day was worse. Small things began to happen, things they tried to explain away at first. The Christmas tree lights flickered violently, even though they were brand new. The kitchen faucet dripped thick, reddish water that stained the sink before running clear again. Footsteps sounded on the roof, too heavy to be a bird, too deliberate to be the settling of snow. Mrs. Frost found the old family Bible torn to shreds, its pages scattered like fallen leaves around the living room. Thomas screamed when he found his favorite wooden soldier toy broken in half, and later insisted he hadn't been alone in his room when it happened. But it was Amelia who changed the most. She grew distant, moody, prone to sudden fits of anger. She spoke less and less to her family, but more and more to the doll. They would find her murmuring to Evelyn in the corners of rooms, having long, one-sided conversations filled with strange, formal words that no 6-year-old should know. Sometimes when they called her name, Amelia wouldn't respond right away. When she did, it was with a slow, deliberate turn of her head, a blank, heavy stare, as if something else was staring out from behind her eyes. Mr. Frost grew increasingly frantic. He tried locking Evelyn away, first in a cabinet, then in a trunk in the attic. Each time the doll found its way back to Amelia's side. "No matter where I put her," Mr. Frost said, trembling, "she returns." Marta's warning echoed in their minds. The doll binds through love, and Amelia loved her. On the third night after Evelyn's arrival, the Frost decided to set up a watch. Mr. Frost stayed awake in the living room, shotgun resting across his knees, eyes never leaving the mantel where the doll now sat propped like a queen on her throne. The fire crackled low, the only light in the suffocating darkness. At first, nothing happened. Minutes stretched into hours. Snow fell in heavy sheets against the windows, muffling the world outside. Then, just past 3 o'clock, the fire sputtered out without warning. The room plunged into darkness. Mr. Frost rose to his feet, the gun heavy in his hands. He fumbled for matches, but as he struck them, a soft creaking filled the room. The sound of tiny feet walking across the wooden floor. The match flared to life. The mantel was empty. The doll was gone. Heart hammering in his chest, Mr. Frost turned in a slow circle, the flickering match casting trembling shadows on the walls. From somewhere behind him, a faint giggle, high, cold and cruel, echoed in the darkness. He spun around, too late. A cold hand brushed against his face. He stumbled backward, the match snuffing out in a puff of smoke. The darkness swallowed him whole. From upstairs, a scream rang out. Clara's voice, shrill and terrified. The Frost family's nightmare had truly begun. The morning after Clara's scream, the Frost household was never the same. Though no one could say exactly what happened during the night, Clara refused to speak of it. A sickness seemed to have seeped into the very bones of the house. The air was thicker, heavier. Every breath and effort. The once cozy cottage now felt like a trap. Thomas was the first to break. At breakfast, he stared blankly at his porridge, stirring it round and round with the spoon, never lifting it to his mouth. When Mrs. Frost asked him gently if he was all right, he didn't answer, didn't even blink. It was as though he hadn't heard her. Clara tried to snap him out of it, shaking his shoulder. That's when Thomas finally looked up, and the whole family recoiled. His pupils were blown wide, the whites of his eyes barely visible. His mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that stretched almost to his ears. He whispered, in a voice that was not his own, "Soon we'll all be together." Then he collapsed, his body folding like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Mrs. Frost shrieked, rushing to her son's side. Mr. Frost lifted the boy, who remained limp but breathing. They put him to bed, wrapping him in heavy quilts, but Thomas did not wake the rest of the day. He mumbled in his sleep nonsense words, or what they hoped were nonsense. But Amelia understood. She would sit at his bedside, Evelyn clutched tightly in her arms, smiling serenely as her brother whispered fevered secrets into the air. The days blurred together, lost to endless twilight and snowstorms that never seemed to stop. Inside the house, time twisted strangely. Clocks stopped working. Meals were forgotten. Sleep brought no rest, only nightmares. Clara tried to keep track, scratching lines into the wooden floor with a knife she had hidden under her pillow. 3 days since the doll appeared. 4, 5, or had it been longer? The lines blurred together. Mrs. Frost grew paranoid. She nailed every window shut, though the cold still seeped in, freezing the very walls. She covered mirrors with sheets and sprinkled salt across every doorway, muttering half-remembered prayers under her breath. Mr. Frost busied himself with plans to destroy the doll. One afternoon, he built a roaring fire and, when Amelia wasn't looking, snatched Evelyn from her arms. Ignoring Amelia's blood-curdling screams, he threw the doll into the flames. For a moment, there was hope. The porcelain began to blacken, hair curling with smoke. But then the fire flared unnaturally, a sudden roaring whoosh of green and blue flame. Mr. Frost stumbled back, shielding his face. When the smoke cleared, Evelyn sat unharmed atop the ashes, her dress untouched, her glass eyes gleaming with a malevolent triumph. Amelia retrieved her, cradling the doll as if nothing had happened. She didn't look at her parents once as she retreated upstairs. Mr. Frost sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. "I can't," he rasped. "I can't fight it." No one answered. They all felt it, the slow, suffocating certainty that they were losing. The hallucinations began next. Mrs. Frost saw her dead mother standing in the hallway, weeping blood. Mr. Frost saw Clara drowned in the bathtub, her hair drifting like seaweed, until he blinked and saw her sitting safely at the kitchen table. Clara herself began to hear voices, her own voice, whispering hateful, violent thoughts into her ear. The walls bled, the floors warped and sighed, and always Evelyn watched. One evening, Clara found herself staring at the doll for what felt like hours, unable to look away. In the flickering candlelight, Evelyn's expression seemed to shift, her smile widening, her head tilting just slightly to the side, as if mocking her. "Come closer," a voice breathed in Clara's mind. Her legs moved of their own accord. Closer, closer. She reached out, her fingers just inches from the cold porcelain cheek, when Amelia yanked the doll away, scowling. "She doesn't want you," Amelia hissed, her voice strange and guttural. Clara stumbled back, heart hammering. Something was terribly, terribly wrong with Amelia. No, not just Amelia, with all of them. Late that night, Clara crept down the hall to check on her sister. Amelia lay asleep, Evelyn clasped tightly to her chest. As Clara watched, Evelyn's tiny porcelain hand moved, a subtle, gentle stroking of Amelia's hair, like a mother soothing a child. Clara's stomach lurched. She turned and fled, not stopping until she was locked safely in her own room. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. The doll wasn't just haunting them. It was nurturing Amelia. It was feeding on them all, their fear, their pain, their unraveling minds, and it was winning. The night the ritual began, the world outside seemed to vanish entirely. Thick, heavy snow fell in suffocating sheets, blotting out the moonlight. The cottage was an island adrift in a sea of white, no path forward, no path back. Inside, the frost gathered by the dying hearth, shivering in the gloom. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was something else. A deep, gnawing chill that reached past skin and into the soul. They had run out of ideas. They had run out of hope. Amelia sat in the corner, humming a tuneless melody to Evelyn, her face pale and otherworldly. Every now and then, she would look up and smile, not at her family, but at something only she could see. Clara couldn't bear it anymore. "We have to do something," she snapped, slamming her fist onto the table, rattling the few surviving dishes. Mrs. Frost flinched. Her hands trembled where they twisted in her lap. "There's nothing to be done," she whispered. "The priest is snowed in. The phone lines are down. Marta warned us." Her voice broke. "She said the bond is sealed." Mr. Frost stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. He paced the room like a caged animal. "Then we break it ourselves," he growled. "No priests, no prayers. We do it our way." "How?" Clara demanded. "The fire didn't work. Locking her away didn't work." "We'll use the old ways," Mr. Frost said, his voice grim. "Older than prayer. Older than this damn thing." From the bookshelf, he pulled down a battered, dusty tome. The Old Faith, Rituals, and Warnings. A relic from his grandmother's time. He opened it to a page marked by a faded black ribbon. Severance of bonds, midnight ritual. The instructions were simple, but brutal. A circle of salt and iron. A binding of blood. The offering of innocence. The fire of purification. Mrs. Frost read over his shoulder, blanching. "No," she said, shaking her head violently. "Not the last part. Not our children." "It doesn't say death," Mr. Frost snapped. "It says offering. We can find another way." But Clara saw the fine print. An offering freely given. An offering freely accepted. And she realized the truth. Amelia had to let go of Evelyn willingly, and there was no way she would. Still, they prepared. They worked feverishly, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting the doll to strike them down at any moment. Mr. Frost pulled iron nails from the walls, hammering them into a rough circle on the living room floor. Mrs. Frost shredded an old wedding dress to use as binding cloth. Clara drew blood from her own palm with a kitchen knife, sprinkling it carefully into the circle. The whole time, Amelia watched them with dispassionate curiosity, Evelyn cradled in her arms. When they finished, Mr. Frost turned to his daughter. "Amelia," he said gently, "come here, sweetheart. We're going to play a game." For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she rose to her feet and walked toward them. Or rather, Evelyn walked her toward them, steering her like a marionette. As Amelia stepped into the circle, the candles around the room sputtered and flared, casting monstrous shadows onto the walls. The ritual had begun. Mr. Frost knelt before Amelia. "You need to give Evelyn up," he said, voice shaking. "Give her to us, please." Amelia tilted her head, her eyes glassy and distant. "She loves me," she said. "I know," Mr. Frost said, forcing a smile. "But we love you too, and we want to keep you safe." Amelia frowned. "She says you lie." "She's wrong," Clara said, stepping into the circle, voice trembling but steady. "She's hurting you, Amelia. Hurting all of us." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. For a heartbeat, Clara saw her real sister, scared, confused, just a little girl clutching her beloved toy. Then Evelyn's eyes gleamed. The doll's mouth moved. At first, Clara thought she was imagining it. But no, the tiny, delicate porcelain lips parted ever so slightly, and a voice, soft, sweet, and filled with venom, whispered, "They'll leave you alone. They'll leave you to die." Amelia shrieked, clutching the doll tighter. "No, no, she's mine! You'll never take her from me!" The candles exploded, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted. The walls trembled, the floor cracked. The salt and iron circle sparked with angry red light. From the shadows beyond the circle, figures began to appear. Children, dozens of them, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. They reached for Amelia, their mouths gaping in silent screams. Clara grabbed her sister's hand. "Fight her, Amelia! You have to let go!" Amelia screamed and thrashed, trying to pull away. Evelyn's grip seemed fused to her arms, the doll's tiny fingers digging into her skin like hooks. Mr. Frost stepped forward, lifting the binding cloth high above my head, ready to wrap it around Amelia and Evelyn both, to tear the bond apart by force. But at the last moment, Amelia looked directly into Clara's eyes, and something broke. With a sob of pure agony, Amelia hurled Evelyn from her arms into the center of the iron circle. The second Evelyn left her hands, the ground split open with a deafening crack. The doll screamed, a thin, glassy, hideous sound, as black smoke poured from her tiny form. Her face twisted, melting, shattering, revealing something beneath, a writhing mass of shadows and teeth and hate. Mr. Frost didn't hesitate. He set fire to the binding cloth and hurled it into the circle. The smoke roared upward, the children's wailing cries echoing through the room. Evelyn's body blackened, cracked, and finally collapsed into a heap of smoldering ash. Silence fell. When they dared to open their eyes, the room was back to normal. The cottage walls, battered and cracked, stood firm. The snow outside had stopped. The air was no longer heavy with death. And Amelia, sweet Amelia, collapsed into Clara's arms, weeping. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't mean to." Clara held her tightly, rocking her back and forth. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over." But deep down, she wasn't sure. Somewhere in the distant woods, a faint giggle echoed, soft and cruel and promising.